In the lawless expanse of the American frontier, where the crack of a six-shooter echoed like thunder across the plains, one name struck fear into the hearts of bankers and lawmen alike: Jesse James. A Confederate guerrilla turned outlaw king, he rode with a gang of hardened desperados, plundering trains and banks in a blaze of glory. But every trail has its end. Saddle up for the outlaw's last ride. The fateful day in 1876 when ambition clashed with frontier grit in the sleepy town of Northfield, Minnesota. What drove this legendary bandit to venture so far north? And how did a band of ordinary townsfolk turn the tide against the infamous James Younger gang? Ride with us into the dust and danger, if you dare. Picture this. The year is 1876, just over a decade since the cannons of the Civil War fell silent. But for Jesse Woodson James, born on September 5, 1847, on a modest farm in Clay County, Missouri, the fight never truly ended. His father, Robert James, was a Baptist minister who helped found William Jewell College, a man of faith and learning who dreamed big but met an early grave. In 1850, when Jesse was just 3, Robert ventured to the California goldfields to preach to the miners, only to succumb to cholera, leaving his family in hardship. Zerelda Cole James, Jesse's formidable mother, remarried twice. First to Benjamin Sims, a harsh stepfather who clashed with the boys, and then to Reuben Samuel, a kinder soul who became a stabilizing force. Yet the scars of loss lingered, shaping Jesse into a young man haunted by instability. Missouri in those days was a cauldron of bitterness, especially in Little Dixie, the slave-holding counties along the Missouri River, where the James family farmed hemp and tobacco. The Civil War tore the state apart, with Union forces imposing harsh measures like General Order No. 11 in 1863, which forcibly evacuated rural residents from border counties to crush Confederate sympathies. Families like the Jameses, staunch Southern supporters, watched their homes burned and livelihoods destroyed by Kansas Jayhawkers, Union raiders who pillaged with impunity. This bred a deep-seated resentment, turning many young men into bushwhackers, irregular fighters who struck from the shadows. As a teenage bushwhacker riding with Bloody Bill Anderson's guerrillas, Jesse learned the art of hit-and-run raids, ambushing Union troops with ruthless precision. At just 16, he joined the fray, perhaps seeking vengeance for the hanging of his stepfather Reuben by Union militiamen, who strung him up 3 times to extract information before cutting him down. Jesse himself bore the war's brutality. In 1865, during a surrender attempt, he was shot through the chest, the bullet lodging near his lung, a wound that plagued him with chronic pain and a persistent cough for life. "We were fighting for our homes, our way of life," he'd later claim, though the line between rebellion and robbery blurred mighty quick. These experiences forged Jesse's unyielding spirit, but also instilled a paranoia and a quick trigger finger, traits that would define his outlaw years. After the war, the South lay in ruins, Reconstruction imposing northern carpetbaggers and economic strangleholds. Banks and railroads, often owned by Yankee interests, symbolized oppression to many ex-Confederates, squeezing poor farmers with high interest and freight rates. Jesse and his older brother Frank, who had ridden with the notorious Quantrill's Raiders, infamous for the 1863 Lawrence massacre that killed 200 civilians, found no peace and surrender. They banded with the younger brothers. Thomas Coleman Cole, born in 1844, a battle-scarred veteran with a fiery temper. Jim, born in 1848, steady and loyal. And Bob, the youngest at 22 in 1876, eager but green. These weren't your run-of-the-mill saddle tramps. They were battle-hardened veterans, skilled with Winchester rifles and Colt revolvers, bound by shared wartime horrors and a code of Southern honor. Their first big score came in 1866, hitting the Clay County Savings Association in Liberty, Missouri, for $60,000, a fortune in those days that could buy a herd of cattle or a sprawling ranch. Banks, stagecoaches, trains, nothing was safe. Legends grew. Jesse as the Robin Hood of the West, robbing the rich railroads that squeezed poor farmers. But truth be told, they kept most of the loot for themselves, funding a life on the run while doling out just enough charity to fuel the myth. Dime novels and sympathetic newspapers, like the Kansas City Times, edited by John Newman Edwards, a Confederate veteran, portrayed them as avengers against Yankee tyranny, turning public opinion in their favor among Missouri's disgruntled populace. Yet beneath the glamour, the life weighed heavy. Jesse married his first cousin, Zerelda Mims, in 1874, named after his mother, seeking a semblance of normalcy amid the chaos. They had 2 children, but the constant evasion took its toll, with Jesse often assuming aliases like J.D. Howard. The emotional scars of war manifested in his letters and rare confessions, revealing a man torn between thrill and regret, a product of a society fractured by conflict. As the gang's exploits mounted, so did the pursuit, with Pinkerton detectives closing in after a 1875 train derailment that killed an engineer and a passenger. Innocents caught in the crossfire. Jesse's world was shrinking, the noose tightening around his neck. By 1876, the heat was on. Pinkerton detectives dogged their trail after a botched train robbery left innocents dead. Jesse, ever the strategist, eyed new territory. Why not head north, he proposed. Minnesota's banks brimmed with Yankee gold, and few would expect Southern outlaws in that frozen prairie. Some historians speculate a deeper motive. The First National Bank in Northfield held deposits from Adelbert Ames and Benjamin Butler, hated Union generals who'd tormented the South during Reconstruction, Ames as Mississippi's governor, Butler as the Beast of New Orleans. Revenge wrapped in robbery. That was Jesse's style, a way to strike back at the symbols of his wartime suffering. The gang, Jesse, Frank, the 3 youngers, Charlie Pitts, a Missouri native with a gambler's edge, Clell Miller, a Rough Rider from Texas, and Bill Chadwell, alias Styles, a Kentucky boy scouting the North, set out in late summer, posing as cattle buyers to blend into the frontier crowds. They scouted Mankato first, but aborted when crowds swelled, the town's fair drawing too many eyes. On September 4th, they turned to Northfield, a quiet mill town of 2,000 souls on the Cannon River. Its streets lined with sturdy brick buildings and hardworking Scandinavian immigrants. Splitting into groups, they camped nearby, sharpening knives and oiling guns under the vast Midwestern sky. Little did they know, this ride would be their last, a culmination of years of defiance born from a war that never truly released its grip on their souls. As the sun set on their campfire, whispers of doubt mingled with bold toasts, the weight of their shared history pressing down like the approaching autumn chill. The sun dipped low over the Missouri hills, casting long shadows across the campfires where the James Younger gang plotted their next move. By 1876, Jesse James and his band of ex-Confederates had become legends, their names whispered in awe and fear from Kansas City saloons to St. Louis boarding houses. But fame came with a price. Pinkerton detectives and federal marshals were closing in, their wanted posters plastering every telegraph pole from here to the Dakota Territory. To understand why these men rode so far north to the fateful Northfield raid, we need to trace the forging of their brotherhood, the audacity of their early heists, and the simmering resentment that fueled their war against the banks and railroads of a fractured nation. This is the story of how a band of war-scarred rebels became the most notorious outlaws of the Wild West, and why they dared to dream of one last, impossible score. After the Civil War's end in 1865, Missouri was a land of festering wounds. Reconstruction policies enforced by Northern politicians and their Southern allies squeezed the life out of farmers and smallholders. Railroads, backed by wealthy industrialists, charged exorbitant rates to ship crops, while banks foreclosed on struggling families with ruthless efficiency. To men like Jesse and Frank James, Cole, Jim, and Bob Younger, and their comrades, these institutions weren't just businesses. They were the very symbols of Yankee oppression that had burned their homes and killed their kin during the war. The James Younger gang wasn't born in a vacuum. It was forged in the crucible of defeat, their raids a continuation of the guerrilla tactics they'd honed under men like William Quantrill and Bloody Bill Anderson. As Cole Younger later wrote, "We were driven to it, sir, by the wrongs done to us and ours." Whether truth or justification, this belief bound them tighter than any blood oath. The gang's core was a mix of grit and loyalty. Frank James, born in 1843, was the scholar of the group, fond of Shakespeare and quiet reflection, yet deadly with a revolver. His cool-headedness balanced Jesse's fiery ambition. Cole Younger, towering and broad-shouldered, carried the scars of countless battles, his charisma masking a volatile streak. Jim Younger, steady and dependable, was the glue that kept tensions in check, while Bob, barely out of his teens, idolized Jesse and yearned to prove himself. Charlie Pitts, a gambler with a quick laugh, brought levity but no less courage. Clell Miller, a Texan with a penchant for brawling, and Bill Chadwell, a Kentucky drifter with an eye for new territory, rounded out the crew. These men weren't just outlaws, they were a family of sorts, bound by shared hardship and a code that valued loyalty above all. Never leave a man behind, never betray the cause. Their early heists were the stuff of legend. After the 1866 Liberty Bank robbery netted $60,000, they struck again and again. Gallatin in 1869, Corydon, Iowa in 1871, even a daring train robbery in Adair, Iowa in 1873, derailing an express for $3,000 in gold. Each job was meticulously planned, Jesse's guerrilla instincts shining through. They'd hit fast, vanishing into the Missouri woods before pauses could form. The press, especially Southern sympathizers like John Newman Edwards, spun tales of their exploits, painting them as avengers who targeted the rich and spared the poor. One story tells of Jesse handing a widow $800 from a bank haul to pay off her mortgage, a tale likely embellished but eagerly devoured by a public weary of Reconstruction's heavy hand. By 1875, their fame had spread, with dime novels selling thousands. Their covers depicting Jesse as a dashing rogue, 6 guns blazing astride a rearing stallion. But the life of an outlaw was no romance. Constantly on the move, the gang lived in hideouts, caves along the Osage River, abandoned farmhouses, or sympathetic farmers' barns. They relied on a network of kin and Confederate loyalists, like Zerelda James Samuel, whose fierce defiance of Pinkertons earned her a reputation as fearsome as her sons. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency, hired by banks and railroads, was relentless. In January 1875, they raided the James family farm, tossing an incendiary device that killed Jesse's 9-year-old half-brother Archie and mangled Zerelda's right arm. The attack, meant to flush out the brothers, only hardened their resolve. "They've made this personal," Jesse reportedly seethed, his hatred for Northern institutions burning hotter than ever. This vendetta shaped their boldest plan yet, a raid far outside their Missouri stronghold. By mid-1876, the gang was feeling the squeeze. A botched train robbery in Otterville, Missouri, had left a conductor dead and the Pinkertons closer than ever. Rewards for their capture soared. $5,000 for Jesse alone. Staying in Missouri meant certain capture, so Jesse turned his gaze north to Minnesota, a land of rolling prairies and prosperous banks, untouched by their raids. The First National Bank in Northfield, Minnesota, was a prize too tempting to ignore. Its vaults held not just cash, but deposits tied to Adelbert Ames, a Reconstruction governor despised by Southerners for his role in Mississippi, and Benjamin Butler, the Union general who'd earned the nickname Spoons for allegedly looting Southern homes. To Jesse, this wasn't just a heist. It was a chance to strike a blow against the ghosts of the war, to reclaim power in a world that had stripped it from him. The decision wasn't without debate. Cole Younger, ever cautious, warned of the risks: unknown terrain, unfamiliar people, and the long ride back. "We're fish out of water up there," he growled, but Jesse's charisma won out. "We hit hard, we ride fast. We're gone before they blink," he promised, his eyes alight with the thrill of the gamble. The gang prepared meticulously, gathering intelligence from drifters and newspapers. They learned the Northfield was a bustling mill town, its bank flush with farmers' savings and railroad investments. Posing as cattle buyers, they bought new suits to blend in, their revolvers concealed beneath long coats. They studied train schedules and mapped escape routes, unaware that their audacity was leading them into a trap of their own making. The cultural shift from Southern raids to a Northern heist reflected the changing West. By 1876, the frontier was shrinking, railroads stitching the nation together, and law enforcement growing more organized. The gang's old tricks, relying on Southern sympathy and rough terrain, might not hold in a place like Minnesota, where Scandinavian immigrants and Union veterans had little love for Confederate outlaws. Yet the lure of a big score and the chance to thumb their noses at their enemies drove them forward. As they rode north in late August, crossing the Mississippi under starlit skies, the weight of their past trailed them like dust. Each man carried his own burdens: Frank's quiet guilt over civilian deaths, Cole's weariness from years of fighting, Bob's desperate need to prove himself. Jesse, though, rode with a fire undimmed, his mind fixed on Northfield, where he believed destiny awaited. As the James Younger gang vanished into the northern horizon, leaving the familiar Ozark Hills behind, the air grew crisper, the landscapes vast and unfamiliar. It was late August 1876, and the 8 riders, Jesse and Frank James, Cole, Jim, and Bob Younger, Charlie Pitts, Clell Miller, and Bill Chadwell, who went by the alias William Styles to mask his southern drawl, pushed their mounts hard across the endless prairies. They traveled light, saddles creaking under bedrolls and saddlebags stuffed with ammunition, their faces weathered by years of evasion. Posing as prosperous cattle buyers from Kansas, they donned fine broadcloth suits and wide-brimmed hats, their revolvers hidden but always within reach. This ruse allowed them to mingle in frontier towns, asking casual questions about livestock prices while their eyes scanned for lawmen and escape routes. But beneath the facade, tension simmered like a pot about to boil over. What possessed these Missouri outlaws to venture over 600 miles north into a land of hardy Scandinavians and Union loyalists? The answer lay in a potent brew of desperation, vengeance, and the intoxicating pull of one last grand score. The road to Northfield was no impulsive jaunt. It was a calculated gamble born from the tightening noose around their necks back home. By summer's end, Missouri had become a hornet's nest. The Pinkertons, that relentless pack of detectives funded by the railroads, had intensified their hunt after the disastrous Rocky Cut train robbery in July 1876, where a botched derailment yielded little loot but plenty of scrutiny. Rewards for the gang ballooned to staggering sums: $10,000 for Jesse dead or alive, turning old allies into potential betrayers. Southern sympathy, once a shield, was waning as Reconstruction dragged on, and federal troops patrolled the border states with increasing vigor. Jesse, the mastermind with a mind as sharp as a Bowie knife, knew they needed fresh ground. "The South's played out," he confided to Frank one starry night on the trail, his voice low against the crackle of the campfire. "Up north, them Yankee banks are fat with gold, and ain't nobody looking for us in cornfields and snowdrifts." Historians have long debated Jesse's deeper motivations, piecing together clues from letters, eyewitness accounts, and the gang's own later confessions. Beyond mere robbery, Northfield whispered of personal reckoning. The First National Bank wasn't just any vault. It held deposits linked to 2 reviled Union figures: Adelbert Ames, the carpetbagger governor of Mississippi, who'd enforced radical Reconstruction with an iron fist, displacing Southern landowners and arming freed slaves, and Benjamin Butler, the notorious Beast of New Orleans, whose wartime occupation of the city included confiscating Confederate property and executing civilians. Ames, in particular, had married into the Butler family, intertwining their fortunes. Some speculate Jesse learned of these connections through Southern networks or sympathetic bankers, perhaps a tip from a disgruntled clerk or a newspaper clipping about Ames's investments in Minnesota railroads. To Jesse, whose family had suffered eviction threats and whose stepfather had been tortured by Unionists, this heist was poetic justice, a chance to bleed the very men who'd bled the South. "It's more than money," Cole Younger later reflected in his autobiography, hinting at the vendetta that fueled their ride. "It was settling old scores from the war that never ended." Preparations for the raid were meticulous, a testament to Jesse's guerrilla-honed strategy. Leaving Missouri around August 20th, the gang rode in loose formation to avoid drawing attention, crossing the Mississippi River near Burlington, Iowa, under the guise of legitimate travelers. They carried maps sketched from railroad timetables and frontier guides, marking ferries, bridges, and back trails. In southern Minnesota, they first eyed Mankato, a thriving county seat with a bank ripe for the taking. Arriving during the town's annual fair on September 1st, they mingled with the crowds, sipping whiskey in saloons and noting the bank's layout. But the streets teemed with farmers, merchants, and off-duty soldiers. Too many eyes, too many rifles at hand. "Too hot," Jesse muttered, aborting the plan after a tense reconnaissance. They pressed on northeast, the flatlands giving way to gentle hills dotted with oak groves and sparkling rivers. By September 4th, they reached the outskirts of Northfield, a serene Quaker-founded town of about 2,000 on the banks of the Cannon River. Founded in 1855 by John North, a miller with abolitionist leanings, Northfield embodied the progressive North, home to Carleton College, a hub for Norwegian and Swedish immigrants who tilled the fertile soil and built sturdy lives far from the old world's hardships. The gang split into smaller groups to scout, camping in the dense woods along the river, perhaps at Dundas or Millersburg, where they could fish for catfish and plot undisturbed. Evenings were spent honing their scheme. 3 men would enter the bank to subdue the staff and crack the safe, while others created diversions outside, firing shots to scatter the populace. They oiled their Colt Navy revolvers and Winchester carbines, sharpened jackknives and rehearsed signals, a whistle for trouble, a holler for retreat. Bill Chadwell, familiar with the North from prior scouting trips, drew crude maps of Division Street, noting the Scriver building housing the bank, the nearby hardware stores, and the bridge over the cannon as their escape funnel. Yet, cracks in their unity hinted at the doom to come. Speculative accounts drawn from survivor testimonies and folklore paint Jesse as increasingly restless, his chronic lung wound from the war flaring in the damp air, making him cough into his bandana. He dreamed big, envisioning a haul of $100,000 or more to fund a new life, perhaps a ranch in Texas or even flight abroad. Frank, the more cautious brother, worried about the cultural chasm. These Minnesotans weren't war-weary Southerners. They were stoic pioneers, many Union veterans armed with Sharps rifles from the Dakota War of 1862, when Sioux uprisings had bloodied the frontier. The gang's Southern accents and mannerisms stood out like sore thumbs amid the lilting Scandinavian tongues. Bob Younger, the youngest, bubbled with excitement, seeing the raid as his rite of passage, while Cole harbored doubts, sensing the shift from hit-and-run raids in familiar territory to this bold incursion into enemy land. The West was evolving. Telegraphs connected towns in hours, posses could mobilize swiftly, and their old ways clashed with this new reality. As September 7th dawned clear and warm, the gang broke camp, hearts pounding with anticipation. They rode into Northfield around noon, stopping at a restaurant for a meal of steak and eggs, their laughter forced to mask the nerves. Little did they suspect that their ambitious leap north, driven by revenge and the allure of untapped riches, was steering them toward a reckoning that would shatter their legend. The cultural divide they bridged so casually, from the humid, feud-riddled South to the crisp, community-bound North, would prove their undoing, a poignant reminder of how the echoes of the Civil War rippled far beyond Appomattox, shaping destinies in unexpected ways. The clock on Northfield's main street ticked toward 2 p.m. on September 7, 1876, the autumn sun casting a golden haze over Division Street, where wagons rumbled and shopkeepers hawked their wares. Unbeknownst to the unsuspecting townsfolk, 8 shadows from the south had converged on this peaceful enclave, their horses' hooves stirring the dry dust like omens of the storm to come. The James Younger gang, after days of scouting and whispered plans in the surrounding woods, was ready to strike. They had lunched at a local eatery earlier that day, forcing down plates of beef and potatoes while scanning the room for threats, their nerves taut as bowstrings. Now, as they rode in formation, the air hummed with unspoken dread, the kind that settles in a man's gut when he knows the die is cast. They split seamlessly, a tactic honed from wartime ambushes. Cole Younger, the burly veteran with a gaze that could pierce steel, positioned himself with his brother Jim and Bill Chadwell at the stone bridge spanning the Cannon River, their Winchesters at the ready to guard the escape route southward. The river's gentle murmur below belied the tension above, where Chadwell, the Kentucky scout with a scar across his cheek from a barroom brawl, fidgeted with his reins, sensing the unfamiliar chill in the northern air. Clell Miller, the Texan brawler whose rough hands had felled many a foe, lounged casually against a hitching post outside the Scriver building, which housed the First National Bank, his eyes darting like a hawk's to ward off intruders. Then came the inside team. Frank James, the thoughtful brother with a poet's soul hidden behind a killer's resolve. Bob Younger, the eager youth whose boyish face masked a fierce determination to earn his stripes. And Charlie Pitts, the gambler with a sly grin and a knife always at hand. They dismounted with feigned nonchalance, tying their sweat-lathered horses to the rail, and strode into the bank as if they were depositing payroll from a cattle drive. The door's bell tinkled innocently, a stark contrast to the thunder about to erupt. Inside the dimly lit interior, lined with polished wood counters and the faint scent of ink and paper money, 3 employees went about their routine. Joseph Lee Haywood, the acting cashier and a pillar of the community, a 43-year-old family man, town treasurer, and deacon at the Congregational Church, stood behind the counter, his spectacles perched on his nose as he balanced ledgers. Beside him was Alonzo Bunker, the quick-witted teller in his mid-20s, recently married and full of ambition, and Frank Wilcox, the young bookkeeper whose steady hand kept the accounts pristine. The outlaws wasted no time, drawing their Colt revolvers with a metallic click that shattered the quiet. "Hands up! This is a robbery," barked one, likely Frank James, his voice steady but laced with southern drawl. "Open the safe, or you're a dead man." Haywood, a steadfast soul whose Union sympathies had been forged in quieter times, he wasn't a combat veteran but had served his community with unyielding integrity, met their gaze without flinching. His heart must have raced, thinking of his wife and young daughter at home, yet he stood firm. "It's on a time lock. Can't be open for hours," he lied coolly, his voice unwavering despite the beads of sweat forming on his brow. The safe, a massive Yale model, was indeed unlocked that day, its door slightly ajar behind the counter. But Haywood's defiance was born of a deeper courage, a refusal to betray his town's trust. The robbers prodded him with gun barrels, their frustration mounting as seconds ticked by. Tension coiled like a rattler ready to strike. Charlie Pitts, his gambler's luck turning sour, vaulted over the counter in a blur, his Bowie knife flashing as he slashed at Haywood's throat, drawing a crimson line that stained the cashier's collar. Haywood gasped, but held his ground, blood trickling down his neck, his eyes locked in silent prayer. In the chaos, Alonzo Bunker saw his chance. With the robbers distracted, he bolted for the back door, his mind flashing to his new bride and the life they dreamed of building. Bob Younger spun and fired, the bullet grazing Bunker's shoulder in a fiery sting, tearing fabric and flesh. But Bunker didn't stop. He burst into the alley, clutching his wound, and shouted with all his might, "Robbery! Get your guns, boys! They're robbing the bank!" His voice echoed through the streets, a clarion call that ignited the town's latent heroism. Outside, the alarm spread like prairie fire in a dry wind. J.S. Allen, the sharp-eyed hardware merchant in his 50s, whose store brimmed with tools and firearms, had noticed the suspicious loiterers earlier. Curiosity drew him toward the bank door, but Clell Miller shoved him back roughly, growling, "Get out of here, old man. Better for your health." Allen's blood boiled. This was his town, built by hard-working folks like himself, immigrants and pioneers who'd fled European famines for a shot at freedom. "There's a robbery going on," he hollered, his voice carrying to nearby shops as he raced back to his store, grabbing a rifle and ammunition. Word rippled through Northfield. Farmers paused their errands, clerks abandoned counters, and women ushered children indoors. The townsfolk, many of them Civil War veterans hardened by battles at Gettysburg or Antietam, didn't cower. They were Norwegians, Swedes, and Yankees who'd tamed this land, their community spirit as strong as their resolve. Henry Wheeler, a 19-year-old medical student home from the University of Michigan for the summer, heard the cries from the street. Tall and lanky, with a future in healing ahead, he snatched an old Army carbine from the Dampier Hotel's rack. Loaded but with no ammunition handy, he improvised, chambering a single round from a display case. Climbing to a third-floor window, his hands trembled not from fear but adrenaline as he aimed down at the unfolding mayhem. The diversion team, Jesse James himself, the elusive leader with his piercing blue eyes and unyielding will, alongside Cole Younger and the remaining riders, thundered down the street on horseback, whooping like banshees and firing their six-shooters into the air. Bullets pinged off buildings, shattering windows and sending shards raining down, intended to scatter the crowd in panic. But Northfield didn't scatter. This wasn't a timid southern hamlet. It was a frontier bastion where neighbors stood together. From doorways, alleys, and upper windows, citizens returned fire with a ferocity that stunned the outlaws. Young Henry Wheeler, peering through his sights, squeezed the trigger. His shot slammed into Clell Miller, blasting the Texan from his saddle with a fatal bullet to the chest, his body crumpling in the dust amid a pool of blood. A.R. Manning, Anselm Reed Manning to be precise, the burly hardware store owner and a crack shot from his hunting days, emerged from his shop wielding a Remington rolling block rifle. Positioned behind a crate for cover, He unleashed a volley, his first round striking Bill Chadwell square in the heart, the Kentuckian toppling lifeless from his horse, his alias dying with him. Elias Stacy, another local, peppered Miller's face with buckshot from a shotgun, ensuring he wouldn't rise. The street erupted in a cacophony of gunfire, smoke billowing like fog over a battlefield, the acrid smell of powder burning nostrils. Inside the bank, the robbers' composure cracked like brittle ice. They rifled through drawers frantically, scooping a paltry 2670 in loose change and bills, mere crumbs compared to the vault's untouched $15,000. The thunder of shots outside seeped through the walls, urging haste. Frank James, his patience shattered, turned to Haywood, who had dropped to his knees in quiet supplication, murmuring prayers for his family in town. "You should have opened it," Frank growled, his voice thick with rage and regret, before firing point blank into the cashier's head. Haywood slumped forward, lifeless, his blood staining the floorboards. A martyr's end for a man whose quiet heroism would echo through history. The inside team burst out the door, guns blazing, mounting their skittish horses amid the hail of lead. Cole Younger grunted as a bullet tore into his shoulder, shattering bone. Jim clutched his thigh where hot lead embedded. Bob reeled from a wound to his elbow, blood soaking his sleeve. Jesse, ever the phantom, wheeled his bay horse with expert grace, barking orders to retreat south, his face a mask of grim determination as he led the ragged survivors away, leaving Miller and Chadwell's bodies sprawled in the dirt like discarded rags. But victory came at a cost. Nicholas Gustafson, a 40-year-old Swedish immigrant fresh off the boat, who spoke little English and misunderstood the frantic warnings, wandered innocently into the crossfire. A stray bullet, perhaps from the gang's wild shots or a defender's misfire, struck him down, his body collapsing near the bank, a tragic casualty of language barriers and chaos. The raid, envisioned as a swift surgical strike, had devolved into a frenzied bloodbath in under 7 minutes, the streets slick with blood and echoing with the moans of the wounded. As the surviving outlaws galloped toward the bridge, pursued by emboldened townsmen, the emotional toll hung heavy, fear giving way to defiant pride among the Northfielders, while the gang tasted the bitter sting of failure for the first time. The acrid smoke from the Northfield shootout still hung in the air as the surviving members of the James Younger gang spurred their horses southward, crossing the Cannon River Bridge in a desperate gallop. Jesse James, his face etched with fury and disbelief, led the way on his swift bay mount, glancing back at the bodies of Clell Miller and Bill Chadwell sprawled lifeless in the street, a grim testament to their failed ambition. Frank James rode close behind, his scholarly demeanor cracked by the chaos, clutching the reins with bloodied hands. The 3 younger brothers, Cole, grimacing through the pain of his shattered shoulder. Jim, his thigh wound seeping crimson onto his saddle. And Bob, the youngest, pale and wide-eyed, with an arm dangling uselessly, struggled to keep pace, their horses foaming at the mouth. Charlie Pitts, the gambler whose knife had drawn first blood in the bank, brought up the rear, his usual grin replaced by a mask of grim determination. They had come for glory and gold. They left with wounds and woe, the paltry $26.70 in their pockets, mocking their dreams. As the outlaws vanished into the tree line southwest of town, Northfield erupted in a frenzy of pursuit. The townsfolk, their adrenaline surging from the unexpected victory, wasted no time. A.R. Manning and Henry Wheeler, heroes of the hour, rallied neighbors, while telegraphs clattered with urgent messages to surrounding counties. Bank robbed, 2 bandits dead, pursue south. Within hours, posses formed, farmers, merchants, and lawmen alike, armed with shotguns and resolve. Governor John S. Pillsbury, alerted in St. Paul, mobilized the state militia and offered a $1,000 reward per outlaw, dead or alive, swelling the total bounty to over $15,000, a fortune that turned every Minnesotan into a potential hunter. This was no ragtag chase. It became the largest manhunt in the state's history, with over 1,000 volunteers scouring more than 400 square miles of dense woods, swamps, and prairies. Pinkerton detectives, long on the gang's trail, joined from Chicago, their network of informants buzzing with tips. The escape was a nightmare from the start. Rain began to pour that very night, a relentless downpour that turned dirt trails into quagmires of sucking mud, slowing their horses to a slog. The gang pushed southwest through the big woods, a tangled expanse of oak and maple that offered cover but exacted a toll. Branches whipped at their faces, roots tripped their mounts. Wounds festered in the damp. Cole Younger's shoulder swelled grotesquely, infection setting in without proper bandages, while Jim's thigh throbbed with each jolt, the bullet lodged deep like a burning coal. Bob, barely 22, bit back cries of pain, his admiration for Jesse turning to quiet doubt. They rode through the darkness, hearts pounding, expecting ambush at every turn. Jesse, his chronic lung wound from the war aggravated by the chill, coughed violently into his sleeve. But his mind raced ahead. "We split up," he urged in a hoarse whisper during a brief halt near Dundas. "Frank and I draw 'em east. You boys head west to the Dakotas." The plan made tactical sense. Divide the pursuit, increase survival odds. But loyalty, that unbreakable bond forged in Confederate camps, held them together a while longer. "We ride as one," Cole rasped, his voice thick with pain and pride, unwilling to abandon brothers in arms. For 2 grueling weeks, the fugitives endured a hellish odyssey through Minnesota's unforgiving wilderness. They ditched their exhausted horses near Lake Crystal after the animals became liabilities, too noisy, too traceable, opting for foot travel that turned their flight into a torturous march. Starved and soaked to the bone, they scavenged what they could: berries from thickets, raw corn from fields, a stolen chicken here and there, its feathers plucked in haste. The weather conspired against them. September's early frosts nipped at their heels, the relentless rains swelling streams into raging torrents they forded with ropes tied waist to waist. Hypothermia loomed, their wool coats heavy with water, boots squelching with each step. Internal struggles mounted. Paranoia crept in as hunger gnawed. Jesse, ever the leader, pushed them mercilessly, his blue eyes flashing with defiance. But whispers of blame echoed. Why Northfield? Why so far north? Pitts, the optimist, tried to lighten the mood with tales of past gambles won, but even he grew silent as exhaustion set in. Skirmishes punctuated the manhunt, heightening the drama like thunderclaps in a storm. Near Shieldsville on September 13th, a posse of locals led by Captain W. W. Murphy, veterans of the 1862 Sioux Uprising, no strangers to frontier warfare, stumbled upon the gang's trail. Gunfire erupted in a dense thicket. Bullets whizzed through leaves as the outlaws returned fire from cover. Charlie Pitts, covering the rear, took a fatal shot to the chest while defending the Youngers, his body crumpling into the underbrush with a final gasp. "Keep going, boys!" he might have yelled, his gambler's luck finally running out. The survivors scattered deeper into the woods, but the noose tightened. Farmers' tips poured in, a bloodied rag found here, a campfire's embers there, guiding the pursuers. Sheriff James Glisman of Wootenwin County, a determined lawman with a mustache like a broom and a reputation for tenacity, coordinated efforts, his volunteers fanning out like wolves on the scent. The breaking point came on September 21st near Medalia, a small farming community amid rolling fields. A local boy, Oscar Sorbel, just 15 and out hunting with his brothers, spotted the ragged strangers hiding in a slough, a marshy depression thick with tall grass and willows. Heart racing, Oscar raced home to alert his father, who tipped off Sheriff Glisman. The sheriff, with 6 hand-picked volunteers, including Captain Murphy and a mix of Civil War vets, approached the Hanska Slough under cover of dawn's gray light. The gang, huddled and weakened, sensed the encirclement. "They're coming," Jesse hissed, but it was too late for flight. A fierce gun battle erupted, the slough echoing with the crack of rifles and the whine of lead. The outlaws fought like cornered wolves, their Winchesters barking from the grass. Pitts was already gone, but the Youngers held the line. Cole, riddled with bullets, 11 in total, shredding his hip, arm, and chest, fired until his ammunition ran dry, blood soaking the earth. Jim and Bob, equally battered, poured lead into the posse, wounding 2 but taking hits themselves. Jim's jaw shattered, Bob's lung pierced. The air filled with shouts and smoke. The posse advancing methodically, their superior numbers and fresh resolve overwhelming the fugitives. Finally, as the barrage eased, Cole's voice rose hoarse and defiant. I surrender. We're all that's left. The three brothers emerged, hands raised, their bodies a map of agony. Cole barely able to stand, supported by his siblings. Jesse and Frank. They had slipped the net days earlier, true to Jesse's plan. Separating near Lake Crystal around September 14th, the brothers rode hard westward into the Dakota Territory, then doubled back south under cover of night. Disguised as travelers, they crossed into Iowa, eventually reaching Nashville, Tennessee, where they hid under aliases. Jesse as Thomas Howard, Frank as Ben Woodson. They lived quietly at first, Frank farming and Jesse plotting smaller jobs. But the Northfield disaster haunted them. The glory days were shattered. Jesse's paranoia deepened, his trust eroding like riverbank soil. He reformed a new gang, but betrayal lurked. In April 1882, in his St. Joseph, Missouri home, gang member Robert Ford, lured by a $10,000 bounty and promises of amnesty, shot Jesse in the back while he dusted a picture frame, the coward's bullet ending the outlaw's ride at age 34. Frank surrendered soon after, tried and acquitted, living out his days as a farmer and lecturer. The manhunt's fury not only captured the Youngers, but etched Northfield into legend, a tale of ordinary folk defying desperados. Tried in Faribault for the murder of Joseph Haywood and Nicholas Gustafson, the brothers pled guilty to spare their lives, earning life sentences in the grim stone walls of Stillwater Prison. Cole, who survived his wounds through sheer grit, later penned reflections, "We tried a desperate game and lost, but we are rough men used to rough ways." Paroled in 1901 after 25 years, he toured with Frank in a Wild West show, a poignant epilogue to their rebellion. The escape and hunt, amid Minnesota's harsh elements and unyielding posses, underscored the Wild West brutal poetry, where loyalty clashed with survival and the frontier's vastness could swallow men whole. The morning mist clung to the Hanska Slough like a shroud as Sheriff James Glispin and his posse closed in on September 21st, 1876, their boots sinking into the marshy ground. The tip from young Oscar Sorbel had led them here, to this desolate patch of wilderness where the remnants of the James Younger gang huddled, their bodies broken and spirits frayed after 2 weeks of hellish flight. Cole, Jim, and Bob Younger, along with the fallen Charlie Pitts, were all that remained of the once formidable band. Jesse and Frank having slipped away days earlier, ghosts vanishing into the vast frontier. The air crackled with tension as the lawmen fanned out, rifles cocked, hearts pounding with the thrill of the hunt. This was the climax of Minnesota's great manhunt, a moment that would seal the fates of these desperate men and etch their story into the annals of the Wild West. Gunfire shattered the dawn silence, bullets tearing through the tall grass as the Youngers fought back with the ferocity of trapped animals. Cole Younger, his massive frame already a canvas of wounds from Northfield, shoulder shattered, hip grazed, fired his Winchester until the barrel smoked, taking aim at shadows in the fog. Jim, his thigh a throbbing mess of infection and his jaw now splintered by a fresh hit, reloaded with trembling hands, loyalty fueling his defiance. Bob, the baby of the bunch, coughed blood from a punctured lung, but squeezed off rounds, his youthful dreams of outlaw glory dissolving in the muck. Pitts, ever the loyal gambler, lay nearby, his body cold from the earlier skirmish, a silent sentinel to their doomed stand. The posse, seasoned by frontier hardships and led by men like Captain W. Murphy, advanced relentlessly. They were ordinary citizens, farmers with calloused hands, merchants who left their counters, transformed into avengers by the raid on their kin. Shots whistled, one grazing Glispin's hat, another wounding a volunteer in the arm, but the outlaws' ammunition dwindled. After a furious exchange that seemed to stretch eternity but lasted mere minutes, Cole's voice rose above the din, hoarse and resigned. "We surrender. Hold your fire. We're coming out." The brothers emerged from the slough, hands aloft, their clothes tattered and blood-soaked. Cole, riddled with 11 bullets, yet somehow standing, leaned on Jim for support. Bob staggered behind, pale as death. The sight was pitiable, a far cry from the dashing desperados of dime novels. Handcuffed and loaded onto wagons, they were carted to Medelia, where crowds gathered, murmuring in awe and anger at these southern invaders brought low. The capture sent shockwaves across the nation. Newspapers from New York to San Francisco blaring headlines of the Northfield bandits' end. Tried in Faribault, Minnesota, the Youngers faced charges of murder for the deaths of Joseph Haywood and Nicholas Gustafson. The trial, a spectacle drawing reporters and spectators. Facing the gallows, they pled guilty on the advice of counsel, trading confessions for life sentences and avoiding the noose. "We were rebels to the end," Cole later mused in prison letters, framing their crimes as an extension of the lost cause. Sent to Stillwater State Prison, a forbidding fortress on the St. Croix River, they endured hard labor, breaking rocks and sewing sacks, their bodies healing slowly under the watchful eyes of guards. Cole, the most reflective, corresponded with historians, penning an autobiography that romanticized their exploits while lamenting the cost. Paroled in 1901 after 25 years, he and Bob, Jim had died in prison in 1902 from tuberculosis, returned to Missouri, where Cole lectured on the folly of crime and even starred in a Wild West show with Frank James, a bittersweet coda to their turbulent lives. Bob, haunted by ghosts, took his own life in 1916, unable to escape the shadow. Meanwhile, Jesse and Frank's fates unfolded like a tragic ballad. After evading the Minnesota dragnet, they resurfaced in Tennessee, living under aliases in a quiet exile. Frank, the introspective one, took to farming, finding solace in books and family. Jesse, however, couldn't shake the outlaw itch. Plagued by paranoia, his war wound a constant ache, his trust eroded by betrayals, he formed a new gang, pulling smaller heists that paled against their glory days. The Northfield failure had cracked his invincibility. He grew suspicious of even close allies. In April 1882, in his modest home in St. Joseph, Missouri, that suspicion proved fatal. Robert Ford, a young gang member enticed by Governor Thomas Crittenden's $10,000 bounty and promises of pardon, waited as Jesse straightened a crooked picture on the wall, his back turned in a rare moment of vulnerability. Ford fired a single shot to the head, killing the legend instantly at age 34. "The dirty little coward that shot Mr. Howard has laid poor Jesse in his grave," went the popular ballad, capturing the public's mixed mourning. Hero to some, villain to others. Frank surrendered months later, tried for murders in Missouri but acquitted amid sympathetic juries and legal maneuvers. He lived to 72, dying peacefully in 1915, a reformed man who shunned the spotlight. The gang's dissolution marked the twilight of the classic outlaw era, as railroads and telegraphs tamed the West, replacing lawless frontiers with ordered society. Reflecting on Northfield's significance, it stands as a pivotal clash where community triumphed over chaos. The raid didn't just fail, it shattered the myth of unstoppable bandits, proving that even in the Wild West's rugged expanse, ordinary folk, armed with grit and unity, could turn the tide. Haywood's defiance became a symbol of moral courage, his grave in Northfield a pilgrimage site. The event spurred banking reforms, like better security and insurance, and fueled cultural fascination, from Buffalo Bill's Wild West shows to modern films like The Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford. In popular lore, Jesse endures as a Robin Hood figure, his rebellion against post-war inequities resonating in tales of the underdog. Yet the human cost, lives lost, families shattered, reminds us of the era's brutal underbelly, where vengeance blurred with villainy. In the end, as the sun sets on those dusty trails, one question lingers. In a land of endless horizons, when does the pursuit of justice become its own kind of outlawry? What do you reckon? Saddle up in the comments below, share your thoughts, and subscribe for more tales from the frontier. Until next time, keep your powder dry. So, what became of the outlaw's last ride? Jesse James's final heist forged a legend of defiance where prairie folk with unyielding spirit turned predators into prey. This Northfield saga echoes through history, illuminating how the Wild West was shaped not solely by gunslingers, but by the resilient souls who called it home. Was Jesse a folk hero avenging Southern wrongs, or a ruthless killer cloaked in myth? Legend spins it both ways, inviting us to ponder the gray between.